When an empath becomes quiet, it may already be over. There is a moment in every empath's life that almost no one notices. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is not announced. It is silence. And when an empath goes quiet, something has already ended inside them. Let's understand why. Silence is rarely the beginning of an empath's withdrawal. It is usually the final stage of a long emotional journey that most people never witness. Before the silence comes effort. Before detachment comes devotion. Empaths are rarely impulsive when it comes to relationships. They become deeply invested. Their minds are naturally tuned toward emotional attunement. They notice micro expressions, tiny shifts in tone, changes in body language, and the emotional atmosphere of a room. This heightened sensitivity is not simply drama or imagination. It is a deeply developed awareness. They constantly process emotional information. They notice what is spoken and what remains unspoken. Because of this awareness, empaths often overfunction inside relationships. They anticipate needs before those needs are expressed. They apologize for tension they did not create. They modify their behavior to maintain peace. They try to keep harmony even when harmony requires them to carry more than their share. Emotional intelligence allows them to read between the lines, but when that intelligence exists without strong boundaries, it can slowly turn into self-sacrifice. They begin carrying emotional burdens that were never truly theirs to carry. In the beginning, they communicate, they explain how something made them feel. They try to clear up misunderstandings. They provide context. They give another person opportunities to understand them. They hope that if they express themselves clearly enough, the other person will eventually respond with the same emotional depth. When that does not happen, they try again, perhaps more gently this time, then more directly, and eventually with visible disappointment and pain. Emotional exhaustion does not usually come from one argument. It develops through repeated experiences of feeling unheard, dismissed, overlooked, or emotionally minimized. The empath's nervous system remains alert, constantly searching for connection and constantly looking for a chance to repair what feels broken. When that repair never arrives, stress accumulates. Fatigue begins to settle in. What once felt like devotion slowly begins to feel like depletion. There comes a psychological tipping point when the empath realizes that the emotional exchange is no longer balanced. They are continuously pouring understanding, patience, compassion, and emotional energy into someone who does not or cannot give the same in return. This realization hurts because it directly challenges their hope. Empaths tend to believe in growth. They believe people can communicate better. They believe wounds can heal. They believe difficult relationships can improve when both people are willing to become more aware. Letting go can feel like failure to them, so they often hold on longer than most people would. But eventually the body begins keeping the score. Long-term emotional strain can lead to internal shutdown. The empath stops starting difficult conversations. They stop repeatedly correcting misunderstandings. They stop explaining every hurt because expressing that hurt no longer feels safe, useful, or productive. This is not necessarily indifference, it is protection. Silence becomes a boundary when words have repeatedly failed to create change. Instead of reacting, they observe. Instead of explaining, they preserve their energy. Instead of trying to convince someone to understand, they quietly step back. The warmth that once came naturally becomes more controlled. Their laughter may become softer. Their responses may become shorter. Their emotional availability becomes more selective. The emotional work they once performed automatically begins disappearing. To people watching from the outside, this can look like moodiness, coldness, or sudden distance. But internally, something much deeper is happening. Their nervous system is choosing stability instead of continued emotional chaos. The empath is no longer fighting desperately to be understood. They are trying to protect what remains of themselves. By the time the silence appears, exhaustion has already changed the relationship from the inside. The empath has slowly moved from hope toward acceptance. They are no longer trying to repair something that feels permanently unbalanced. They are beginning to understand that empathy without reciprocity can become self-abandonment. And once that awareness finally settles in, their quiet is no longer confusion, it is clarity. By the time an empath becomes truly quiet, something profound has often already happened within them. They may have grieved the relationship long before anyone else realized that it was ending. Unlike impulsive departures fueled by anger or frustration, an empath's detachment is often preceded by deep emotional processing. They do not simply wake up one morning and decide that they no longer care. They gradually come to terms with what is no longer working. Empaths reflect constantly. After conversations, they replay what happened. After disagreements, they analyze not only what was said, but what was meant behind the words. They question themselves. Did I misunderstand? Did I react too strongly? Did I expect too much? Could I have explained myself more clearly? Was there something I could have done differently? This internal examination is not necessarily insecurity. Often it comes from their genuine desire to be fair. They want to understand both sides. They want to take responsibility for their own behavior. They want to know whether they contributed to the problem. In the beginning, this kind of reflection can actually strengthen a relationship. It can create accountability, understanding, and emotional growth. But when the same patterns continue repeating, something changes. When apologies lead nowhere, when promises are repeatedly broken, when behavior never matches words, and when emotional availability remains inconsistent, reflection eventually becomes realization. And realization is where grief begins. Grief does not belong only to death. Grief can also come from unmet expectations. It can come from slowly accepting that the relationship you imagined may never become the relationship you actually experience. It can come from recognizing that the future you pictured with someone may not exist. Empaths can feel this particularly deeply because they may become attached not only to who a person currently is, but also to who they believe that person could become. They see possibilities, they notice potential, they imagine growth. They can see the better version of someone even while that person continues repeating the same harmful patterns. And letting go of someone's potential can sometimes hurt more than accepting reality, so they begin grieving quietly. They grieve the conversations that never happened. They grieve the effort that was never equally returned. They grieve the intimacy that slowly became one-sided. They grieve the version of the relationship they kept hoping would eventually appear. This grief can happen while they are still physically present. They may still show up. They may still smile. They may still answer messages. They may still participate in everyday life. But internally, something is loosening. Their attachment is slowly becoming weaker. Their nervous system begins adapting to the possibility of separation. Their expectations become lower. Their emotional investment becomes more cautious. They stop imagining the future in the same way. They stop assuming that things will eventually change. And this is what makes private grief so powerful. It can create closure before the actual departure. By the time an empath physically withdraws, they may have already cried the tears. They may have already processed the disappointment. They may have already asked themselves every difficult question. They may have already imagined what life could look like without the connection. This is why their silence can feel sudden to everyone else, but to them, it was never sudden. It was gradual acceptance. And acceptance changes everything. Once an empath accepts that their emotional needs are not going to be met in the way they need and deserve, persuasion begins losing its power. Promises can start feeling too late. Dramatic gestures can feel reactive rather than meaningful. Sudden affection may no longer create the same emotional response because internally the goodbye has already been spoken. When an empath becomes quiet, you are often not witnessing confusion. You are witnessing completion. They are no longer fighting for the relationship inside their own mind. They have begun releasing it internally first. And once the mind lets go, the heart often follows. When an empath goes quiet, it can mean that the emotional door has already closed, not with anger, not with revenge, not with dramatic confrontation, but with a calm finality that other people may easily underestimate. Empaths are often communicators by nature. When they care, they reach out. When something feels wrong, they try to repair it. When they feel wounded, they attempt to translate that pain into words. Their voice becomes a bridge between themselves and another person. So when that voice disappears, something fundamental has changed. Emotionally mature people understand that connection is maintained through responsiveness. It is not perfection that keeps a relationship alive. It is repair. A missed moment can be forgiven. A misunderstanding can be explained. A mistake can be acknowledged. A difficult conversation can create deeper understanding, but repeated emotional neglect is different. Repeated dismissal is different. Constant defensiveness is different. A lack of accountability slowly destroys emotional safety. And emotional safety is the foundation of vulnerability. An empath does not necessarily stop speaking because they have nothing left to say. They stop speaking because they no longer believe that speaking will create anything different. There comes a moment when they realize their words are being tolerated rather than absorbed. They are being heard but not truly understood. Their feelings are acknowledged on the surface but never deeply considered. Their pain may be recognized for a moment only to be repeated again later. At that point, another explanation does not feel like communication anymore. It feels like exhaustion. So the empath becomes quiet, and that quiet is not empty. It is filled with everything they have already said, everything they tried to explain, every conversation they repeated, every opportunity they gave, every promise they believed, and every disappointment they quietly carried. The silence is not the absence of emotion. It is what remains after emotion has been exhausted. And when you finally notice the quiet, you may think the empath suddenly changed, but they did not suddenly change. You are simply noticing the change that happened inside them a long time ago. Their silence is often the final chapter of a story that they spent months, sometimes years, trying to save. And when an empath finally chooses silence, it may not be because they stopped caring. It may be because they finally realized that caring about someone should never require abandoning themselves. A relationship requires two nervous systems that are willing to regulate and connect with each other. When one person repeatedly avoids self-reflection or refuses to explore emotional depth, the empath eventually begins to feel completely alone. Even while having conversations, feeling lonely within that communication can be more painful than being silent. At that stage, something begins changing inside the empath. Their energy starts shifting from giving to conserving. Instead of constantly initiating difficult discussions, they begin watching the patterns. Rather than confronting every small rupture or disagreement, they allow a little more distance to develop quietly. This is not manipulation, it is recalibration. The emotional door does not suddenly slam shut. Instead, it closes slowly and gently. First, they stop explaining themselves again and again. Then they stop trying to correct every misunderstanding. Then they stop trying to be completely understood by someone who has repeatedly demonstrated a limited ability to understand them. When an empath chooses not to express something that once would have mattered deeply to them, that does not necessarily mean they have become indifferent. It often means closure has already begun forming. When the brain experiences repeated relational stress, it naturally begins moving towards self-protection. Emotional effort becomes more selective. Attention becomes more guarded. The empath starts asking themselves internally, is this safe? Is this mutual? Is this worth the emotional cost? And when the answer repeatedly remains no, withdrawal begins to happen naturally. To the other person, it may seem as though the empath suddenly became distant. But in reality, the empath simply stopped being the only person holding the emotional door open. And here is the crucial truth. Once that emotional door closes for an empath, reopening it takes far more than a simple apology. It requires consistent emotional safety, visible change, and trust that has been rebuilt through actions. Because by the time the silence becomes noticeable, the bridge they once worked so carefully to maintain may have already been dismantled. They are no longer trying to reach you. They are beginning to return to themselves, and that return is rarely reversed simply because someone outside suddenly wants access again. It can appear sudden. One day, the empath is engaged, responsive, warm, and emotionally available. The next day, they appear calm, distant, and almost unaffected. People often wonder, what happened? What changed? But what appears to be an overnight transformation is usually the final stage of a long internal process of recalibration. Empaths detach in layers. In the beginning, they give the other person the benefit of the doubt. They assume stress, confusion, misunderstanding, or emotional immaturity may be responsible. They become more patient. They become more understanding. They attempt to regulate not only their own emotions, but sometimes the emotions of the other person as well. This is the first layer, overcompensation. When that does not restore balance, they gradually move into the second layer, reduced reactivity. They stop reacting to every small disappointment, not because they fail to notice those disappointments, but because they have started calculating the emotional cost of engaging with each one. They begin wondering whether every issue deserves another portion of their emotional energy. The third layer is much quieter, yet incredibly powerful. They stop sharing their inner world with the same openness they once had. Their stories become shorter. Their vulnerability becomes more carefully chosen. They no longer reveal their deepest fears, hopes, or dreams in exactly the same way. This is not punishment. It is discernment. Then comes emotional neutrality. This stage is often misunderstood by the people around them. Neutrality can look like maturity. It can look like calmness. It can even look like peace. Yet psychologically, it can also be a sign that emotional attachment is weakening. The empath is no longer riding the emotional highs and lows of the relationship. They are watching rather than participating. They are collecting information instead of continuously investing hope. Detachment in this sense is not calculated manipulation. It is an adaptive response. The mind is designed to protect itself from repeated emotional pain. When attempts to connect and emotional bids are repeatedly ignored or rejected, the brain can gradually reduce attachment intensity in an effort to prevent additional harm. By the time the empath becomes noticeably silent, they may have already practiced what life feels like without depending emotionally on the relationship. They have imagined independence. They have emotionally rehearsed what separation might feel like. They have strengthened parts of themselves that once depended heavily upon that connection. So when they finally step backward, the movement can feel surprisingly steady. There may be no dramatic confrontation, no explosive ending, no final speech filled with anger. There may simply be a quiet change in energy that communicates finality. The most unexpected part is that this detachment often arrives with clarity instead of bitterness. The empath is not necessarily searching for revenge. They are looking for alignment. They are choosing environments where their empathy can be appreciated and reciprocated rather than constantly consumed. And once self-respect becomes stronger than attachment, tolerance for emotional imbalance begins to disappear. That is why the change can feel so sudden to the other person. Because what you are witnessing is not the beginning of the process. You are witnessing the result of everything that happened before it. One of the quietest yet most powerful changes that happens before an empath withdraws is this. They stop searching for validation from the very person they once desperately wanted to understand them. Empaths naturally seek shared meaning. When conflict happens, they usually do not only want to win the argument, they want emotional resolution. They want to feel seen. They want their inner experience to be acknowledged and understood. In emotionally healthy relationships, this kind of validation strengthens attachment and creates deeper trust. But when validation is repeatedly denied, minimized, ignored, or redirected, something inside the empath begins to change. At first, they try harder to communicate. They improve their wording. They soften their tone. They wait for what they believe is the right moment to speak. They hope that if they explain themselves more clearly, the other person might finally understand what they are experiencing. They hope better communication will somehow unlock empathy in the other person, but when all that effort continues to go unanswered, they can begin questioning themselves. Am I being too sensitive? Am I asking for too much? Am I expecting something unreasonable? This kind of self-questioning can come from strong self-awareness. But when there is no reciprocity, it can gradually weaken their confidence in their own emotional reality. Eventually, an important realization begins to take shape. The problem may not be the way they are explaining themselves. The problem may be the other person's emotional capacity. Not everyone has the ability or willingness to validate emotional depth, and recognizing this can become a major turning point. Once an empath understands that their emotional needs are unlikely to be met in that space, they eventually stop repeatedly asking for those needs to be met. They no longer wait for reassurance. They stop looking for emotional acknowledgement. They stop trying to prove that their feelings are reasonable or worthy of consideration. This is not necessarily emotional shutdown. It can actually be the beginning of emotional independence. Psychologically, validation can help regulate the nervous system. When someone responds with, "I understand why you feel that way," the body can soften. A sense of safety increases. But when validation is consistently absent, the empath may slowly learn to provide that validation for themselves. They journal instead of constantly confiding. They reflect instead of repeatedly requesting reassurance. They process their pain privately rather than repeatedly exposing themselves to the possibility of dismissal. And here is the critical transformation. Once a person learns how to validate themselves consistently, external validation begins losing its urgency. The empath is no longer emotionally dependent on being understood by you. That changes the entire dynamic because persuasion, charm, affection, and even apologies depend upon some degree of emotional access. But when the empath no longer needs another person to confirm their worth or interpret their experience for them, that access becomes much narrower. They become grounded in their own perception. They begin trusting their emotional intelligence again. And once that internal trust has been restored, they stop negotiating it with other people. When an empath becomes quiet, it can often mean they have stopped looking to you for something they have finally learned how to give themselves. And that kind of independence is rarely easy to reverse. When an empath becomes quiet, many people automatically assume the silence is punishment. They may interpret it as manipulation, passive aggression, or an attempt to make them feel guilty. But in many situations, that quietness is not about controlling another person at all. It is about finding peace. Empaths are often familiar with emotional turbulence. They may spend months, sometimes even years, navigating tension, replaying conversations in their minds, carrying disappointments that were never spoken aloud, and attempting to regulate both their own emotions and someone else's. That level of emotional vigilance can become deeply exhausting. It keeps the nervous system in an almost constant state of alertness. For an empath, silence can eventually feel like relief. It can be the first complete breath they have taken after carrying emotional weight for far too long. When they stop arguing, it does not necessarily mean they have nothing left to say. It may mean they no longer want to fight to be understood. When they stop reacting, it does not automatically mean they have stopped caring. It can simply mean the emotional chaos has finally disappeared from their system. Their body no longer prepares itself for the next emotional impact. Their mind no longer rehearses explanations or imaginary conversations. At first, peace can feel strange. It can almost feel empty because they have become so accustomed to emotional intensity. But eventually, that emptiness begins to feel stabilizing. Psychologically, human beings naturally move toward environments that provide a greater sense of safety. When a relationship repeatedly activates anxiety, defensiveness, uncertainty, or disappointment, the brain can begin associating that relationship with stress, even when genuine love still exists. Ongoing emotional stress can gradually weaken the sense of security within a connection. Eventually, the empath may recognize that remaining emotionally engaged is costing them more than quietly stepping away. This realization is usually not dramatic. It is steady. They begin noticing how peaceful they feel when they are no longer trying to fix everything. They notice how much mental space becomes available when they stop analyzing another person's behavior. They notice how much energy returns when they stop overextending their empathy.